Good afternoon, guys. So in lieu of getting your own experience making these fiberglass cradles, I'm actually going to try to make a small video for you guys so that you can at least see the process instead of just seeing some pictures and some descriptions. So without further ado, I'm going to start. Bear with me if you can't hear me. I'll try to speak as loud as possible for my camera. So the first step to any kind of fiberglass clamshell making is to have a specimen that needs to be rehoused. So this guy right here is actually a humerus from an Archaeotherium. So that would be this arm bone, if you can see that. So this guy had been originally mounted in a toilet paper and Johnson & Johnson bandage, or JJ bandages, and you can see that I can pull this and rip it off. So this really isn't the most stable or archival material in the world. So today we're going to give it a better home. So the first step, if you have something, obviously you want to take it out of its jacket. Hopefully you don't break it. If you do, then you'll have to repair it. But first you want to look at your specimen. What is the best or flattest surface on your specimen where it's going to sit the best? You can see this surface is kind of curved. This surface is actually probably the best. That's what they were using in this jacket too. So that's what we're gonna jacket that surface on. So to do that, we're gonna take our humerus and we're gonna just dig it out a little bit of space in our sandbox. Remember, sandboxes are really useful tools in fossil preparation. So we're gonna just set it in there. And the next step we're gonna have is you wanna find the midline on your specimen. So what that means is we're basically gonna try to cut this humerus in half to find that halfway mark. So once I find that halfway mark, I'm just going to pedestal sand around it on that halfway. You might see my face because I'm trying to get it as nicely as possible. So if you notice in this jacket, it was also a very tight jacket, and this is not the worst specimen I've seen where it has a nice tight-fitting jacket. But the issue with having those tight-fitted jackets is that you're going to have trouble getting your specimen back out if someone wants to look at it. So that's something you want to start considering as you start to flatten around your specimen. I found that halfway mark. And you also want that halfway mark so that if you end up doing a full clamshell jacket, you have half of your specimen contained in half of the jacket and half of your specimen contained in the other half. Another thing you want to consider as you're thinking about maybe tight jackets is there any spot on your fossil that has an undercut or you're afraid is going to get caught in your jacket? So in this guy, I might be afraid of this area right here. I'm not too concerned about it because the foam that we use is thick enough to where that's probably not going to be a problem. But I will probably have to make a dart right here with the foam that we're going to use. So that's going to be our next step, is getting a piece of foam. So I have this nice big piece of foam. I'm obviously not going to use this whole long piece. Instead, I'm going to go ahead and cut it down to size, if I can find my scissors. So now you cut it down to size. You need about 3 inches around your whole specimen So usually what I'll do, especially when you're doing this alone, is you're going to take sandbags and set it on top of your specimen to kind of hold it in place. Make sure that when you're cutting it, you're not going to get any awkward spots where you might have cut it too short. And so the next thing you're going to do is, you can kind of see where the end of the specimen is here for feel. You can flip it up to check it. So you want to have about the width of your hand, or about 3 inches. So obviously my width of my extremely tiny hands is going to be different from your maybe larger or smaller hands. So always keep that in mind, but it's about a 3-inch width. And so part of that is, this is going to give you some wiggle room for when you actually create your jacket. So if you don't get it to line up exactly right or something, you kind of have some room for error. And then these little areas around there, the 3-inch extra space, is going to end up becoming the lip of your jacket. So that when you create the second half of your clamshell, you can use that as a template for the surface of your second jacket, and you have a spot where you can bolt those two sides together, so that if you flip them in the jacket, that the jacket is going to be stable when you flip it, and it's not going to allow the fossil to shift while you flip it over. Another thing that you also want to consider with your foam, this is 1/4-inch ETHAFOAM, so it's the thicker version of ETHAFOAM. We also use 1/8-inch pieces in our lab, but usually when we're making jackets, we use the 1/4-inch, especially if you're working on a larger specimen. If you're working on something smaller like this humerus, you could use the 1/4-inch too. My preference is, the 1/8-inch, but my preference is actually the 1/4-inch, just because it adds a little extra cushion to your fossil, and it's not going to break down as quickly as the other stuff. Another thing you want to consider, and this is going to be extremely hard to see on a camera, but this ETHAFOAM has 2 sides. So one is a more smooth side, and then the other side is a little more bubbly. So you want to try to get that smooth side on your specimen, because that's going to have less abrasion and less chance to catch on your specimen when you're removing it from the jacket. So always try to get the smoother side if you can. Some people can't tell, especially older people might have issues trying to figure that out. So either phone a friend to help you who has better eyesight than you, or just do the best that you can. So again, I'm going to start cutting and trimming this jacket, or the foam. So again, you want that about 3 inches around your specimen. I like to make it rounded edges. And these edges you're going to end up trimming the next day or whenever you complete the jacket. So don't feel too bad if your shape is kind of ugly. You're going to have a chance to edit that in the future too. And of course, this might be a more involved process if you're doing something larger than an Archaeotherium humerus. But really, you can do this on any size specimen. Fiberglass is very strong, so it's going to be a lot sturdier than something like burlap or quilt batting. It's going to last a longer time, and it doesn't have as much of a tendency to peel like an onion over time like burlap does. So if you've ever worked on an older specimen that has its jacket failing or something, it's usually that burlap, because the layers are, they're not completely incorporated, so they have that tendency to peel. So now you can see I have trimmed my foam down, and I'm going to see how it lays on my specimen. So I'll use my handy dandy sandbags, and you'll see that right here this is sticking up, and then right here this is also sticking up. So one thing that we'll also have to do is dart these corners just like we would dart like a skirt or maybe a dress. And then we'll adhere these darts together, and then we'll be ready to start actually jacketing this specimen. The first thing we're going to do before I dart though is we're going to cover the sandbox with plastic, and then I'm actually going to roughen up that foam so that it has a better adhering capability than it would have, so that when I plaster it, the foam is going to attach better to that plaster. And so you always want to cover your sandboxes and your specimen, because obviously you don't want to get plaster in your sandbox and get it all dirty, and you really don't want to get plaster on your specimen, because that's going to be a world of headache trying to remove it. So now my sandbox is covered. Next, we're going to take our foam, and remember, you want to do this on the bubbly part of your foam. I'm actually going to grab a face mask at this point so that I don't inhale anything that I might break up in the plastic itself. So when you're starting your plastering, jacketing process, you want to make sure that you have gloves, you have on some kind of apron, and you have eye protection, and then you want some kind of a respirator, some kind of inhalant protection. You're going to be working with fiberglass, so that means it's going to have tiny little particles of glass all over the place. Glass has silica in it, so that's going to be really bad for your lungs if you're going to inhale it. So keep that in mind if you end up doing this yourself one day. Normally, I would also be wearing my respirator, but if I wore my actual respirator today, you wouldn't hear me. So an N95 dust mask will work just as well. Since I work in the lab all the time, I usually use a respirator, and then if I'm really picking up dust, I'll use the air system too. But because you wouldn't be able to hear me, I'm not going to use the air system today. So again, we're going to start roughening up this foam, and I'll try to give you guys a close-up of what the end result looks like. So again, I'm going to check to make sure that I have the right side on my specimen. And then the side that's not touching my specimen is the side that I'm roughening up. So this is going to be that side that is going to touch the plaster. So you can take a sandpaper, or you can take a wire brush and roughen up your foam. So I just do short motion, and I try to get every spot on the foam. you're not doing this too hard because you might puncture your foam and then you're going to have to make another trim and another piece of foam. So if you do that, you're going to have to redo it. That's another reason the thicker foam is a little nicer to work with, because you run less of a chance of abrading too much with it. So now I'm checking to see if I have little fluffies on this side. So I'll try to see if you guys can see that. There's just a little bit of plastic that's sticking up, so it looks like little hairs. So what that's gonna do is help the plaster adhere to your foam. So now I'm going to place it back over the specimen, grab my sandbags, and make sure it's where I want it to be. I can do this by feel, or I can lift up my plastic bags and see where my specimen is. So again, you want to make sure you get a good tight fit on your specimen, but not so tight to where you can't get it out of the jacket at the end. So especially right here, I'm going to need that dart. So I'm going to take my scissors, and all you do is you cut a slit in your foam. Next, you're going to see, which way fits better. So this looks pretty good right here. Let's try the other side. I actually think that looks even better. So that's the way I'm going to adhere those two pieces back together. So there's a couple different ways you can get these flaps to go back together. You can use a hot glue gun with low heat hot glue so it doesn't melt your plastic. Or some people prefer to sew these back together with something like taxidermy thread. I like the glue because it's easier to remove if something deteriorates with it, and it's a little faster. So that's what we're going to use. And that's also why I decided to go ahead and cover my sandbox, so I don't accidentally get hot glue on my specimen while I'm doing this. So I will go on the edge of the piece that I'm going under, and then I will hold this in place until they stick together. And then I'm going to go ahead and glue the rest of it together on the opposite edge to make sure that that's a really good adhered spot. I'll let that cool off for a minute to make sure that everything's going to stick together. And then I'm also going to seal this so that hopefully when I use that plaster, that seam won't leak. And then I'm going to hold it a couple more minutes to make sure that that cools off correctly and it keeps itself adhered. And then we're going to do another dart on this side of the jacket too. Another thing you can do to help this process, if you don't want to hold it the whole time, you can gently put a sandbag on it to hold it in place. Just make sure that you don't accidentally glue it to your sandbag. So next we'll see where we need a dart over here. So it looks like we'll need a dart right across here. So again, figuring out which side looks best. I'd say this side goes over a little bit more naturally. So again, I'm just going to hot glue the side that's going under first, just on the edge. trying not to get the plastic in your glue. Better than your fossil though. Keeping that held down. And then go ahead and going back, gluing that other side. And then going ahead and trying to seal that in. So while that dries, I'm going to unplug my hot glue gun. So now, once these seams are done, you're basically ready to start plastering. We've set up our specimen, we have it halfway through, we've roughed up and trimmed our foam, and now we've darted our foam. So this is going to be the layer that's directly in contact with your fossil when you finish the jacket. The plaster will never be in contact with your fossil. So the next couple steps are really crucial that you set them up as best as possible before you start mixing your plaster. If you don't have everything together, when you start mixing your plaster, you're probably going to end up with a bucket full of set plaster that you can't use. So always try to keep yourself as prepared as possible. That being said, here's a couple things that you're going to need. You're going to need a bucket. You're going to need some Vaseline. You're going to need maybe some scissors. You don't need your wire brush anymore. Maybe you want some cake spatulas. I have this handy dandy cart that has my fiberglass in it, and it can hold my bucket of plaster. I also use disposable plastic cups to scoop up my plaster, and that helps decrease the mess of using plaster when it's so liquidy. You also might want to think about getting splash-proof goggles. You want to make sure you're wearing your mask because you're dealing with that fiberglass, and you're going to be dealing with plaster powder, which also has silica in it. You'll need a couple pieces of paper towel, and you might want a couple gloves. These are really nice gloves. I think they're Mr. Clean brand, but they release plaster really well, so you can actually reuse these gloves for every time you make a plaster jacket. And you'll also want several sandbags. 4 seems to be a good amount for this jacket, but if you're working on something else, you're going to want more sandbags. And for this first layer, you're also going to want another plastic bag of some sort, because this first layer is going to be the most important layer, and we'll go over that in a minute. So once you get all this stuff together, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to lube up your bucket. So you're going to take your Vaseline and your paper towel, and you really only need a little, just a little bit, so like not even that much. And then you're going to rub your bucket all over with that Vaseline. And now that you've rubbed it all over, you're going to try to rub it out with your clean paper towel. So you really only need a micro layer of Vaseline. And this is going to help release any unused plaster that you use out of your bucket, so that expands the longevity of your bucket. are very old, so they have some plaster still in it. So I'm going to go ahead and dump this out, but this bucket is now ready for accepting plaster. So having some kind of setup and being as organized as possible is always important in this task, because when you start mixing that plaster, you're going to have about 20 to 30 minutes to work with it. And again, this first layer is going to be the most important layer because that's what's going to hold the shape of the rest of your jacket. So you should also have your fiberglass ready. So what I've done is I've pre-cut strips of fiberglass to show you guys what they look like. There's a bunch of different types of fiberglass to choose from, different types of sheets. What we have here in the lab is more of like a large roll of boat fiberglass. So it ends up being like this, and it's a lot thicker. But you can actually peel these sheets apart and get 4 to 5 sheets out of one little square of this fiberglass, which is really nice. It is a little more messy than some of the other types of fiberglass that people use. So again, this is the boat fiberglass and it's continuous strand. You always want to make sure whatever you're using is continuous strand and not chopped strand. So I'm just showing you the different layers out of that one piece of fiberglass. So you want a layer, that's like the perfect layer. So you might be able to get several pieces out of that one square, which is nice. It lasts a long time. So I have those little squares, and then I have a couple longer pieces, and then I have some even longer pieces that are left over from another project. So the nice thing about this is that if you don't use it all for this jacket, you can always use it for your future jackets. So now that I've got my bucket full of Vaseline, I have my foam ready, my space is covered in plastic, I have my fiberglass trimmed, I have my other piece of plastic ready as well as my sandbags. Now we're going to start mixing our plaster now that we're all ready to go. So I've already gotten a predetermined amount of water. So when you're mixing plaster, it's generally a 2-to-1 ratio, 1 being the water and then 2 being plaster. So for in this case, I have a half cup of water, so I'll be using 1 full cup of plaster for this first pour. And really, if you're using something this small, you probably don't even need that much, but these are the ratios and cups I have right now. Alright, so now that we're ready to plaster, we put our half cup of water in our bucket, and now we're going to put our full cup of plaster also in the bucket. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm just going to gently pour it out. I'm not going to start mixing until everything is already in the bucket. The moment you start mixing is the moment that your plaster starts to set up. So in order to have the optimal amount of time to mix everything, you want to make, or to work with everything, you want to make sure you don't mix it right away. So I'm gently just sprinkling it in there, trying to get an even coating on the bottom so that we have an even distribution on the bottom of the bucket. You might also be able to see a cloud forming of all the plaster dust that's getting picked up right now. Right now would also be the time to be wearing your gloves, your face mask, and your goggles. So now that that is dumped out, I'm going to make sure that I have everything one last time, and then I'm going to start mixing my plaster. So the plaster we're using is USG #1 casting plaster. Other people like using USG FGR, maybe just even plaster of Paris from DAP, but this is what we have in our lab. So you want to make sure when you're mixing your plaster that you're going to work through all of the chunks. Some people even like to sift their plaster as they pour it into their water so they don't have to do this step. Either way works fine. Just make sure that you get it nice and mixed up. You don't want any chunks as much as you can. And so for a small jacket like this, as we apply our fiberglass, you want to think, how many layers do you want for your jacket? So now I'm going to start pouring my plaster over that foam. And as I do so, I'm going to start rubbing it into the foam just to make sure that it's getting into all of those places that I roughed it up beforehand, so that it's going to adhere a little bit better to your foam layer. And the cool thing about this foam is that if for some reason it degrades and you want to replace the foam, but you don't want to replace the whole jacket, it isn't adhered enough to where you couldn't pull it out and then maybe glue a new piece of foam back in there. So that makes the jackets a little bit more versatile. So now that it's all spread out, some people don't do this step where they put a layer of fiberglass in this first layer. I prefer it because it gives that first layer even more rigidity, and it's a little easier to deal with when you're making your next layers. So you want to make sure that you're keeping track of how many layers you have on your jacket. For this one, I'm going to cut one of these in half too, because I don't need a full square. So always make sure you have your scissors on hand. Yes, you're going to get them a little plastery, but it might save you some material in the end. So now I've laid my plaster on there, or my fiberglass, and I'm going to continue with that plaster layer. So really we didn't use a lot of plaster this time. That means my bucket is going to have that be removed once it's set, but because that Vaseline is in there, that won't be a problem. So if you're making a jacket this big, you probably only want like 3 layers maximum. Really, 2 layers will do the job for fiberglass. But again, we're going to stop after this first layer because that's how it's going to help retain its shape. And you can kind of notice this is kind of a rounder jacket. So we're probably going to end up adding a foot to it, or a block ETHAFOAM, a block of ETHAFOAM, to make sure that this jacket will sit flat on a horizontal plane. And I tried to make the plaster a little thicker this time so it would set up a little quicker. But I'm also going to add that extra on there just to help make sure that this is going to be a nice rigid first layer. So you see I'm kind of trying to smooth it out as much as possible. That's always a good step to take. So now that this is all covered in fiberglass and plaster for that first layer. We're going to add another plastic barrier, like I mentioned before. And now we're going to add sandbags so that we can try to retain the shape of that bone as best as possible. So this is really important because, again, this is what's going to give you that nice tight fit of your jacket, but it's also going to make sure that your bone is supported as best as possible. So there might be spots where you want to hold them down. Maybe a sandbag isn't doing it justice. Maybe you're doing okay and you like what you see. And for this first layer, you could let this sit overnight if you wanted. It really sets up, it retains its shape after about 20 to 30 minutes. So with plaster, it has an exothermic reaction. So when this starts turning warm or feels warm to touch, that's usually when I know that it's starting to retain its shape and I can continue with my next layers. So we're going to just let this sit for a little bit and let this set, and then we'll continue. Alright, so now that this is set, we can start with the last layer that we're going to need for this jacket. So the first thing you do is remove all your sandbags. You won't need those for the rest of this time. And then we're going to peel back that plastic that we put on there. And hopefully it'll come up pretty easily. And so now we have that nice tight looking jacket. It's holding its shape quite well. It is pretty warm, not too bad. So that chemical reaction's still going on where it's setting. So the first thing that we're going to do is figure out if this specimen is going to need some kind of foot on either side of this jacket to make sure that when it's on that horizontal plane, it's going to not wobble. So I have this nice piece of wood to see if we need something. And it looks like we probably do. You can see it's kind of tilting. So these little scraps of block ETHAFOAM are really useful for this kind of thing. I think this piece will probably be enough. So it's really just trying to carve it and make sure that it's going to sit pretty well on your specimen. So if you make cavity mounts and you have extra pieces of block ETHAFOAM like this, you can always save some of it to use for your jackets. So that looks pretty okay right there. But obviously this is gonna be too tall, right? So we're actually gonna go ahead and cut that down. We really just need a little bit to support it, and we might end up cutting this in half and just having little supports here and there. So we're going to cut this in half. And see if we can't support it this way. Alright, so I've made my little foot out of a couple of scraps of ETHAFOAM glued together with paraloid. So if we check this little foot, we'll see that it's a lot less shaky than it was. So this isn't really an exact science. It doesn't have to be perfectly level. It just needs to be enough to where once your specimen is in your jacket and we've flipped it over, it's not going to wobble or anything. So we just want to make it as stable as possible. So again, you can use these little blocks of ETHAFOAM and a little bit of paraloid or even low heat hot glue to glue those together. You could even choose to glue it to your jacket, but I like to roughen these up and then wrap them in fiberglass before I adhere them to the jacket. So that is the method that I use. Some people might just glue them down, but I think you get a little bit more of a stable support if you coat it in that fiberglass and plaster before you add it to your jacket. So again, we are going to be making that second layer of fiberglass. Since this is such a small jacket, we really only need that second layer. This isn't a heavy specimen or a really big one, so that would be pretty good. If you're dealing with something even larger, you probably want to use 3 to 4 layers, or if you're working on like extra large things, I'd probably go 5 to 6, if not more, just to be on the safe side. I'd rather have more layers on my specimen so I know that jacket's going to be extra sturdy than not have enough layers and then have that jacket fail and then break the specimen. So again, I'm just using that same ratio of half a cup of water to a full cup of plaster, and then a little bit more. And so before you do this stage, maybe while this is setting, you want to make sure you have enough fiberglass for this round. And then you want to make sure you have something like a spatula or be prepared to basically smooth out your jacket and make it look nice in the finishing touches of the jacket. So this time around, what I could have done is actually laid the fiberglass on my jacket before I started to make it an even quicker process, but since it's such a small jacket, I'm not too worried about it. But I'm actually going to take the foot now and dunk it in plaster and then wrap it in fiberglass and replace it back on the specimen. Some people also prefer to dip their fiberglass in plaster and then put it on their jacket. I don't like doing this because I can never get our sheets to go back to being a sheet. So that might be something you want to think about depending on, you know, what type of fiberglass you're working with. Again, we're working with the boat fiberglass. You can get something called bale fiberglass that is much finer and easier to work with. It comes in thinner sheets. It is more expensive, however. So if you're on a budget or something, you might want to think about that too. So now I'm just going to add that second layer of fiberglass. And now I'm going to pour more plaster over it. So you want to make sure that with this foot you have a good couple layers over it so that, you know, it's going to stay in place. And in my experience, these feet actually become very, very sturdy. So as long as you wrap it up, you take those proper precautions, that foot shouldn't be any less sturdy than the rest of the jacket. So now I've got that second layer covered. I'm going to kind of work towards solidifying the foot a little bit more. Right now I'm kind of waiting for that plaster to set up more, because as soon as it starts to set up, it's going to start looking kind of like marshmallow puff pastry. And at that point, that's a really good spot to start smoothing out your jacket, making it nice and smooth so that when researchers go to pick it up, it's not going to catch on their hands as much. You're going to try to seal in that fiberglass, etc. Also, sometimes you might get ugly little balls of fiberglass. These can be really useful for your feet because it can help support them, kind of gap fill any spot that might be drooping or anything else of the sort. So it's a really good tool. All parts of fiberglass can be used, so especially if you're on a limited budget, make sure you keep those pieces. So again, I tried to make this batch a little thicker too, so that it'll thicken up quicker, it'll be a little easier to smooth out, because it'll be setting quicker. One thing you can do while you're waiting for it to set is, if you want to get a glass of water, you can use that water as your plaster sets, and if it sets up a little too fast, you can add that water, and that can kind of help you re-sculpt and reinvigorate that plaster, so you have a little bit more time to sculpt it. So now we're just going to play that waiting game of waiting for the plaster to set up. And it's already set up pretty well, so it's probably not going to take too long for it to get to that marshmallow puff pastry. If you look at my gloves, they're already starting to set up themselves. So when you start to smooth out your jackets, your gloves are going to clump up like this. So my recommendation is either to use one of those cooking spatulas or be brave and use your hands to smooth it, because your hands are going to be easier to clean off. And I think it's a little easier to use to sculpt or smooth out with. But that's really up to you and whether or not you want little tiny shards of fiberglass in your hands. They do work themselves out. Gorilla Tape works really well for getting them out of your skin if you somehow get it in your skin and you didn't even take off your gloves. So keep that in mind too. So now I have my cup of water, so I'm ready for this to start smoothing out. It's still pretty liquidy, but it is starting to set up. So I'm going to start smoothing it out. Again, these spatulas work really well, especially if they're silicone, because they're easy to clean up and they're therefore reusable. So you can see kind of how nice that's smoothing out. These spatulas are really useful. And maybe you can see that in the camera. This is kind of where it's starting to set up, and look at like that puff pastry. You can smooth it out as much or as little as you really want. If you are drawn to the artistic side of things, this is really going to make it more aesthetically pleasing. And again, this is kind of going to help seal in that fiberglass too and make it less of a danger on those researchers that might be handling your specimen or the jacket. This is by far my favorite part. And so there might be spots where the spatula doesn't work as well. So maybe you want to go back with your fingers or your gloves and kind of smooth it out even further. It's really starting to set up now. So this is like the ideal time to start doing this. You also want to make sure that if you have any extra little fiberglass pieces sticking up, that those have been sealed in one way or the other. If you need to add extra plaster, you can. I always try to make a little extra for this last edge or this last step, so that if I find spots that need extra, or I just want to put extra on my jacket, that is an option. Someone also suggested to me that you would be able to smooth it out by sanding it all over the place. And I suppose you could do that too, but I like doing this because this is less work in the end. And it's less stress on your jacket if you're using another power tool on it. And just like that, the jacket's done for the day. So I recommend letting it sit at least overnight or for 24 hours before you start taking it off your specimen and trimming around the edges and finalizing your jacket. Ideally, I'd probably recommend 48 to 70. Hey guys, so this is the second clip for making a fiberglass clamshell jacket. So we've already made the jacket itself, so today it's really going to be about finalizing the jacket that we have here, taking it off the specimen, making sure it fits, and then trimming the jacket and sealing it up, and then we'll be ready to go. So the first thing we're going to do today is take off the jacket and see how that fossil actually fits in the jacket itself. So what you do is you just gently take your jacket off of your specimen. Peel that plastic off. And so you can see this is what it ended up looking like. You can see some of the plaster has kind of leaked through on top of that foam, but that's really easy. You can just break that off and you'll see that in a couple minutes. So this is our old jacket, if you remember. So now this is our new and improved jacket. So we're going to take off our trash bags from the sandbox. I'm going to grab that jacket again. And we're going to place our humerus in the jacket. So I'll move him over, get some of this excess fiberglass out of the way. And so you notice, one thing you always want to remember is how you actually will put your specimen in your jacket. Luckily, this is a pretty easy shape. It's pretty obvious where it goes, but not all jackets are that obvious. So you might want to keep in mind how you take it off, which side is which when you flip it. So we'll take Mr. Humerus here and just see how he fits. This is actually fitting really nicely. It's very tight on this curve right here, but it's not tight enough on this condyle to where you can't easily take it out of the jacket. So this is actually a really nice jacket. Next, we're going to actually kind of trace out the areas that we want to trim off the jacket to make sure that we don't have these ugly edges that might catch on yourself or a researcher. So I'm just going to gently mark this stuff out using a ballpoint pen, which is removable with acetone. So if I need to remove it at any point, I can using that acetone, or likely I will be cutting it away using my power tool. And again, you want to make sure you have that nice lip around the whole thing, because if I make a second half to this clamshell, this is going to be that second side or that template, so that you basically will make your other jacket on top of this jacket so that these edges meet nicely together. For this specimen, we won't be making a second side, however. It doesn't really require it, and we have enough space in collections for this specimen where it won't matter at the moment. However, if we run out of space, we might consider making a second side to this so we can stack specimens, but at the moment we are okay. So I've marked those little markings there, and so now what I'm going to do is cut or trim this jacket, I'm going to take out my specimen first. You never want to trim your jackets with your specimens inside of them. You always want to make sure that they aren't going to either accidentally get cut or vibrate loose and then break. So over here, before I start cutting on my jacket, I'll just show you the tool that I'll be using. This is the Dremel 3000. It has the cutting attachment. This is my preferred tool because it goes really quickly and it's not a heavy duty tool. If you're cutting through a jacket that might be much larger, you might want to consider another tool. Dremels tend to overheat over time, so you always want to make sure that your tool is not going to overheat when you do this. And you also want to make sure that you're using every safety precaution you can. So some other tools you might be able to use, people have used oscillating saws, jigsaws, any kind of cutting implement. This just happens to be my preferred tool. So safety-wise, I'll be wearing some work gloves to make sure that I don't cut myself. I'll be wearing eye protection. There's always a chance that plaster can fly up and hit you in the eye, so you don't want to have that. So you want some impact-proof eye protection. I'll be wearing ear protection because we will be using our air system, because this does kick up a lot of dust, and I don't want to be breathing that in. And the air system, unfortunately, is incredibly loud. And I'll also be using my real respirator, again, just because I'll be kicking up a lot of dust and I don't want to breathe that in. So you won't be able to hear me talk if I try to talk or anything. So I'm just going to film part of me cutting this jacket. And before I do that, I'll describe what I'm going to do. So I'll plug in my Dremel, and then I'll start cutting along the edges of my jacket. And in order to make sure that I'm not going to cut my table or my equipment, I'll put my jacket over here, and I'll actually use sandbags to weigh it down so that, I can use two hands on the tool, but my sandbag or my jacket isn't going to start tipping back and forth. And then I can also prop it up with another sandbag so I don't end up accidentally cutting my table. So now you can see that we have trimmed our jacket. Looks a lot better than it did, right? So the next step that we're going to do is to actually sand these edges to make them smoother and easier to handle for your sake, the collection manager's sake, and whoever else handles these fossils. So again, I'm going to turn on the air system and I'm going to use our nice handheld sander. And again, I'll be wearing that same safety equipment to protect myself and my lungs and my eyes and hearing from any hazards I might come across. So now you can see that we have sanded the edges of this. They're nice and smooth. We've cleaned it off. We've brushed off any excess dust or anything that occurred while we were creating this jacket. So the next thing to do would be to seal the surface of this jacket using either something like Paraloid B72 or Bootvar B76, just using a small concentration, so usually like 10% is what we use in our lab. So what you would do is you would get your Bootvar or your Paraloid and you would squirt it all over the jacket, and you would just paint that layer as best as possible. In our lab we usually have designated paintbrushes for what glues we're using at the time. And then you would let that sit for 10 minutes or 10 to 15 minutes, maybe half an hour, maybe you go have lunch or something. And then you'd come back and you would actually record the museum or catalog number on the jacket somewhere, to where if you were looking at it from a high shelf, you could see that number maybe on the side, just anywhere where you'd be able to see it easier. One of my students usually puts it on the foot of the jacket as long as it's a little bit bigger than this foot, because that's a good flat area and it usually is visible when you are looking at the jacket. This one's a little small, so we probably won't do that, but that is an option. So I'm actually not going to be sealing my jacket right away, just because I can still feel that it's cold to the touch, and so I will end up completing the sealing step and then the labeling step later on for my own jacket. But I'm just going to explain, I just wanted to explain that process so you would know what you can do. Another thing you could do to your jacket, say you have a label and you want to make sure that that label stays in this jacket, but maybe you want to make sure that it's more secure than just setting it on top of the specimen. One thing you can do is you can actually take that 1/8 inch foam, that really thin foam, and you can cut out a little pocket to the size of your label, and then you could glue it on one of the nicer flat sides, especially if you aren't going to make that second side of your clamshell jacket. And then you could use hot glue to just glue it in place, let that dry, and then you can slide your label right in there too. So that's one thing you can do. I've also seen some of my students do this for vials. So say our humorist has a vial, you could basically make a little slot for that vial using this 1/8 inch ETHAFOAM, and then just slide that vial right in there too, so that everything's together, other than, you know, having a separate box for that kind of information or anything like that. I will say one important thing if you choose to rehouse your specimens in this is to make sure that your specimen is labeled, so that way if it gets separated from its housing or it goes on display, you can match the number on the specimen to the information that's going to be labeled on your jacket. So with that, that's really all you have to do. So to summarize those last steps, you would seal your jacket just painting it with something like 10% Bootvar B76 or 10% Paraloid B72, and then you would let that dry. You would label your jacket, and then you could flip it over, put your specimen back in it, and maybe create a little envelope for labels or a way to hold any extra vials that might be present for your jacket. With that, thanks for watching and have a great day. Since I didn't do the second side of my clamshell for that Archaeopterygium humerus, I figured I would show you an example of what an end product looked like, and then give you some pointers as to how to make your jacket even better than this guy. So you can see here, if I hold it up a little bit, there's this seam right here all the way around. You can see the foam on that side, and then you can also see the jacket on both sides as well. So first criticism, nothing has been written on this jacket to tell me what SDSM number or catalog number is associated with this specimen. So that's one of my first issues. So that would have to be added to really complete this two-sided clamshell jacket. My other criticism would be usually these jackets are bolted together using bolts, washers, and wing nuts. So the reason you would want that lip that we talked about as we were making our jacket is so that you have those extra spaces around your fossils, so you can strategically put bolts in different spots of your jacket so that if you wanted to flip it over, you could. So in this case, this is a pretty heavy jacket, so I wouldn't really be able to flip it over because these aren't adhered together using bolts and washers and those wing nuts. So if I take that first jacket off, you can see how nicely this actually does fit in the jacket. It's pretty tight around here. The fit is one of my other criticisms. One of my other criticisms is that whoever cut this jacket or created this jacket made too close of a cut right here and then right here. So you wouldn't be able to bolt those spots in place, and then again right on this edge of the bone too. So those are just a couple criticisms of this jacket. Again, it's not labeled correctly. It's not cut as skillfully as maybe it could have been. That's why you always want to test your jacket before you cut it. You want to make sure you can put your specimen in there and then maybe trace around it so you don't get these really close shaves to your bone. And then of course when you're cutting it, take the bone out before you even cut it. But having that traced line is going to help you make a better jacket, so you don't have to waste all that time and effort you put into making this fiberglass jacket. Another thing you could do is actually physically label your specimen too. This specimen hasn't been labeled with its catalog number yet either, so that is another thing you could do. But I just wanted to show you guys what it looked like to have a two-sided jacket so that in the future you can make one of these jackets. And it's really the same process as making that first half clam that you saw. This time, however, you wouldn't be using a sandbox. You could just use the template of this flat jacket to make this other side. So you could cover this in plastic and then start creating this jacket using that foam, plaster, and fiberglass.